Hello, Geography of Transportation students. I hope that this recorded lecture finds you healthy and well and managing all the different things you're having to manage. And I also hope that this lecture is a welcome distraction from scrolling into the annals of Netflix or whatever else you're finding to keep yourselves entertained inside and physically distant from others. So the topic for today is urban transportation finance, which I know sounds really exciting. Trust me, it is. I'm going to make the best of it. And as difficult as it is to translate lecturing in person, where I can look in your eyes and I can see your nods of understanding and I can see your hands raised for questions and I can expand on the things that you seem interested in, I now find myself hiding out in my house, trying to find a place where the acoustics are beneficial and talking to a laptop. So again, this isn't how we hoped to end the semester, but I'm going to try and make the best of it, and thank you for coming along with me. So if you've ever wondered why public transportation is the way it is, it's probably the availability of funding as much as it is about planning. We've talked a lot about planning so far. We've talked a lot about how TransLink has 10-year plans, how transportation fits into the City of Vancouver's plans, and equitable transit. We've talked a lot about, looking into the future, but we haven't talked about what it is that makes that planning possible, and it comes down to funding, this idea of follow the money. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to follow the money. So I want you to remember that what is planned depends on the availability of funding. It isn't very straightforward either. So Mayor Cote's game that he designed did an excellent job of modeling how complicated funding structures can be, the different hoops you have to go through to get funding, and also with that coin toss, just sort of the whims of whoever's making the decisions about funding. Whether it's an election year, all these things can have a cost to bear on whether or not public transportation gets funded or not. Transportation finance explores how transportation networks are paid for. So that's sort of the baseline that we're going to be exploring today. Transportation finance as a topic in the geography of transportation explores how transportation networks are paid for. So our commitment to social distancing and being physically distant from others during this crucial time that we have to flatten the curve for COVID-19 means that a lot of us are spending probably a bit more time on our screens than we normally would. And social media has not disappointed with the content that's been produced. And I came across this the other day and wanted to share it with you about what our daily commutes are looking like these days. Mine is actually a lot smaller than this because I share about 700 square feet with two other humans. One is very loud. So anyways, I thought I would share this with you and trying to build connections with our current situation and the geography of transportation. The big idea for today's topic of urban transportation finance asks you to consider how urban transportation is funded and how that funding impacts user experience, access, and employee rights. And if you can think of any other categories that you could add on to this in tutorial discussion, that would be great as well. But these are three ways that you can begin to consider the impacts of urban transportation funding. The three things I'm going to focus on to explore the topic of urban transportation finance are listed here. First, I'm going to give you a basic overview of different types of funding models. We're going to take a deep dive into public-private partnerships, also called P3s. And finally, we're going to look at transportation poverty and transportation equity. And particularly, we're going to look at fares and policing and begin to think about the ways that transportation finance has an impact on transportation equity. So the first overview of funding models takes a top-down approach, so looking at how public transportation is funded. And then the final category looks at transportation finance from the bottom up. So I'll be focusing today mainly on Canada's urban transportation finance, but I'm giving you a quick overview of how the US funds their transportation, just so we can have something to compare it to. So in the US, for several decades now, there's been a permanent funding model in place, and that was put in place in the Urban Mass Transportation Act. And that dictates that 20% of all federal gas taxes and vehicle fees are earmarked specifically for public transportation upgrades. So no matter what, cities across the US can count on having a portion of that 20% of the taxes that are collected by the federal government. So it's quite stable. I mean, it's not perfect. Things have, those transfers have slowed down substantially in the recent Trump era, but that funding is still guaranteed, even if it's getting out to cities more slowly. Canada, on the other hand, does not have a dedicated permanent funding agreement or structure. The federal level, so the Canadian government only provides capital funding, and by that I mean that it only funds actual infrastructure. It doesn't cover, and it can't be used to cover any operational or other types of cost. So, what's the problem here? The problem is that not having a dedicated funding or transfer structure in Canada means that funding can become a bit of a political game. And that political game doesn't always align with the planning imperatives of different transportation authorities. So, for example, in TransLink, it's mandated that there has to be a 10-year plan in place. And Mayor Cote, who is head of the Mayor's Council that we met with a few weeks ago, is in charge of implementing that next 10-year plan. The problem with making plans into the long term, 10 years, and that's really sort of a small-ish window when it comes to transportation planning. The problem with that is that because funding is more ad hoc, because every 4 years max we have an election here, it's not predictable, it's not guaranteed. A study in the Globe and Mail found that whatever party is in power, higher investments go to ridings where the MPs are part of that ruling party. So, for example, during the Conservative Harper years, much larger amounts of public transportation infrastructure investments went to ridings where there were Conservative MPs, and the same was found under the Liberal government. So because funding's ad hoc and no predictability, it makes it difficult to plan. So that's the first major point. The other thing is it's a lot more competitive market. Regions and municipalities have to barter and pitch their ideas directly because there's no guarantee. It's difficult to plan transportation infrastructure long term, for example. So Canada's transportation finance model, especially from the federal level, is ad hoc or unpredictable, which makes it difficult for transportation authorities to plan in the long term because the availability of funds could change, at least every 4 years. Canada's funding structure can also turn the procurement of funds into a bit of a political game. So cities are competing with one another for projects. Negotiations have to be made between different governing parties, and perhaps the federal government has a different idea of what sorts of investments can and should be made, as opposed to putting more power in the hands of transportation authorities locally. So a good example of this is trying to extend the Broadway line, and how TransLink has been in a bit of an arm wrestling situation for many, many years now, trying to get the government to put up some funds for that. And finally, the federal government only provides capital funds, And that means that funds can only pay for the material infrastructure of transit. So for example, light rail transit lines, subway tracks, streetcars, and bridges. So just the material infrastructure can be funded by the government. It doesn't pay for personnel, it doesn't pay for equipment, it doesn't pay for wages and salary, it doesn't pay for different types of non-material upgrades to public transportation. The money is only allocated for building stuff and not actually running it. Similarly and relatedly, transit quality is often evaluated in a way that emphasizes infrastructure investments, such as the length of transit lines or extension of transit lines. And these metrics are valued over other types of metrics, such as frequency of service or percentage of people who use a certain type of transportation, or sort of the degree of equity in place in that transportation system. So it's interesting. It's an interesting predicament because you can buy as many buses as you want and you can have a new maintenance facility. But with the funds, you can't increase the number of service hours. You can't hire more drivers because you don't have that operating budget. So what good is a new rail line if cities don't have the money to operate it? And where does that money come from? So Canada does have a gas tax transfer. I wanted to tell you that, but it's problematic because unlike the U.S., public transportation is just one of about 30 categories of infrastructure where that gas tax transfer can be invested in. So public transportation is just one of many other types of public infrastructure. So it's really a bit of a coin toss whether the gas tax transfer will be invested in transportation. So this is going to be an overview of the different types of funding sources for urban transportation in Canada. So first there's federal contributions, and those are usually in the form of federal grants, although increasingly more they're in the form of loans through public-private partnerships, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. There's also provincial contributions, also in the form of grants. At the municipal level, this includes funding that's received through municipal taxes, and this is except in the case where transit systems have direct taxing authority. It can also be provided through general municipal operating grants, so in city budgets, and general municipal capital grants. So again, capital grants go to the building of actual material infrastructure. Other ways that urban transportation is funded includes funding from dedicated taxes, where legislation grants the transit system the authority to implement revenue tools that are dedicated to transit. So this includes different types of levies and taxes and fees. For example, in Vancouver, taxes built into parking fees and also gas fees. Other examples are it can be built into property taxes. And other contributions in revenue, this includes revenues from advertising, from terminal concessions, from different investment income, to different types of charters, the selling of maps, etc. And then, also I skipped here, the thing that probably most often pops into mind is passenger fares. But passenger fares only make up a portion of how urban transportation is funded. And we'll talk more later about how sort of the bigger proportion of the funding structure passenger fares have, the more disproportionately individual users might be punished or policed. The three things I'm going to focus on to explore the topic of urban. So, the question is, how do the major sources of funding in Canada for public transportation come together? They usually come together through private-public partnerships, or P3s. A private-public partnership is a legally binding contract between government and business for the provision of assets and the delivery of services that allocates responsibilities and business risks among the various partners. So this is a way of using government funding, coming together with private funding, and created sort of a blended financial model to build infrastructure. And according to Partnerships BC, which is an arm of the government that really kind of rolled out this approach to public transportation finance in the early 2000s, the benefits of P3s include improving service delivery. So it allows both sectors to do what they do best, since the government's core business is to set policy and serve the public. It will take care of that while the private sector takes responsibility for other types of functions, such as operating and maintaining buildings. So the idea here is sort of a divide and conquer approach. We don't want to have government employees taking responsibility for things that they're not really specifically tasked to do, such as building management. The other thing is it's said to improve cost effectiveness, so it takes advantage of private sector innovation, experience, and flexibility, and that is thought to make the delivery of services and the building of infrastructure more cost effective than other traditional approaches where there's just a full holistic publicly funded model. The idea here is that this improved efficiency, those savings are going to be passed on to the users at the end. There's increased investment in public infrastructure this way because they're able to bring in private partners. There's going to be more funding available, and therefore more investment is going to happen. And it's also thought to reduce public sector risk by transferring the risk involved in doing these sort of multi-million, sometimes billion-dollar projects. The idea here is that through private-public partnerships, that risk is shared. And in a lot of cases, especially when P3s were first beginning to be more popular and more widely used in British Columbia, the private partners took on more of that risk. So if the market suddenly changed or if interest rates changed, the risk of putting on and carrying out these big projects was mostly assumed by the private partners. Also, the idea behind this is that things would be built faster because the private sphere is so efficient, and we all know the common complaints about public service delivery and public services are usually not efficient. Things take a long time. There's a lot of waste in the system. The idea of bringing private partners in to work on public projects is that these things would be completed more quickly. Now I'm going to give you an example in a few slides about how how all of these sort of benefits are not actually captured in some of the biggest private-public partnerships that have been carried out. So what exactly went wrong with the Canada Line? First of all, it was way over budget. The original budget that was approved by TransLink was for $1.56 billion. The private sector won the contract to build the Canada Line with a bid of $1.9 billion, and the final project cost nearly $2.1 billion. And yet, despite this, the provincial news release claimed that the project was on budget. So TransLink said that they could do it for $1.56 billion. The private contractor won it for $1.9 billion, and the final cost was $2.1 billion. So it went way over the original budget. What about innovation and integration? Well, another thing here that you hear a lot, according to the QP report, is that private sectors are really where innovation happens, and it's difficult for public infrastructure to create innovation when it comes to public transportation. The problem with this is that companies are competing with one another, and they often respond to different pressures to reduce costs. And usually the corners that are cut here is quality. So in order to keep costs down, especially when a project is going over budget, quality of design is no longer a priority. So through the bidding process for building the Canada Line, it was led by two different private sector consortia. One was Bombardier and the other one was SNC-Lavalin. You might, the name SNC-Lavalin might ring a few bells. Prime Minister Trudeau was in some hot water over his dealings with that company and favorability of that company. SNC-Lavalin did win the contract, largely because they relied on trains and tracks with technology that's older and less innovative and therefore cheaper. And the result, unfortunately, was that that system that they put in isn't compatible with any other SkyTrain line, so integration became difficult. The other problem with P3 has to do with transparency. So when a project is publicly funded, all the allocation of costs, so where the money's going, is publicly available information. And it's always, you can always track it down, even if you have to put in a freedom of information request. Because it's taxpayer money, there's accountability built into that structure. When you bring in a private actor, the public can't get information about how public funds are being spent anymore. They also can't get information or have accountability on how the project is responding to community needs. So for the Canada Line project, there was no way to ensure fair competition. There was no way for the public to know how the money was being spent, and a lot of difficult questions weren't able to be asked. So P3 is being responsive to communities. There was a lot of opposition from the community for the project. There was a flawed consultation process, the QP report found. They chose a construction method that caused a lot of disruption to surrounding communities and created a lot of financial hardship for local businesses. So there really wasn't a way for the private company carrying out the contract. There was no way to hold this company accountable for the disruptions that they caused. And this accountability would have been better met had it been a fully publicly funded project. And finally, and this is the most troubling aspect of this particular case study, is the prioritization of profit over working conditions. So through the Canada Line construction, SNC-Lavalin was found guilty by WorkSafe BC of exploitation of temporary foreign workers. They were forced to pay a penalty to WorkSafe BC for the death of an employee. Also, SNC-Lavalin was and a recruiting agency were required to pay $1.25 million to a group of temporary foreign workers from Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Colombia. The BC Human Rights Tribunal awarded the workers compensation for being grossly underpaid and for injury to their dignity and self-respect. So again, this is has to do with transparency, but it also, I mean, this is a gross argument to make, but you know, the project ended up costing a lot more money because the private company tried to cut so many corners with underpaying and having unsafe working conditions for temporary foreign workers. Instead of employing, local workers, they instead outsourced to more precarious workers and brought them in and underpaid them and ended up paying the price for that. And also the workers themselves that came and were hired to complete this project, one paid the ultimate price. So we can see through this report that a lot of the promises of P3 transportation funding models are left unmet, and we can see that it can lead to a lot of problematic outcomes when it comes to building sort of these big mega public infrastructure projects for transportation. So how, when, and why do P3 public-private partnership urban transportation projects go wrong? So the previous slide talked about all the benefits of using this funding model, and we're going to turn to some of the critiques of that as has been produced by QP, so the Canadian Union of Public Employees, did a case study of TransLink's Canada Line. So the Canada Line is an expansion of the region's public transit system. It was accomplished just ahead of the 2010 Olympics. It was finished in 2009. And it built onto Vancouver's existing SkyTrain system. Some of you will remember Trevor's lecture about the Expo line was the first part of the system to be built. It was completed in 1985. It was completely publicly funded at a cost of $854 million. The second SkyTrain line, which is the Millennium Line, was a $1.2 billion project. It was also fully publicly funded. It was completed ahead of schedule and also under budget. TransLink's planning for the Canada Line began in the year 2000, and it was clear from the beginning that the provincial government was intent on building the line as a P3. TransLink was pursuing a fully publicly funded finance model from the beginning, but it came up against a lot of roadblocks from the province. The province actually threatened to pull their portion of the funding if TransLink did not agree to this public-private partnership model. So now that a lot of major projects have happened over the past 2 decades through P3 financing models, and we have a wealth of data and research, such as the case report, that's contents I just reported to you, made by CUPE. We have a lot of knowledge now about the downsides of P3s. One would hope that the government would revamp this funding structure and take strides to eliminate some of those downfalls, especially when it comes to worker safety and who is assuming the risk of building these capital projects. So the Canadian Infrastructure Bank, the CIB, was created by the Liberal government in 2016. And it is touted as sort of this new medium through which public-private partnerships can flourish. And it was created on the outset to make up for some of the downfalls and roadblocks and frictions involved in P3 models. So the Canada Infrastructure Bank is a Crown corporation, so that means it exists as sort of like arm's length from the government itself. It's governed by a board of directors. Most of the directors on that board come from private equity firms and other private entities. The bank is, quote, responsive and accountable to the government and Parliament through the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities. So there's some oversight, but not a lot of say or, quote unquote, meddling in the decisions made by the Canadian Infrastructure Bank. So the CIB was handed from Trudeau a $35 billion budget allocation with a mandate that this $35 billion would be invested over an 11-year period beginning in 2016. This is being called a historic Investing in Canada plan. And the CIB was presented as an additional tool to sort of streamline and make more efficient these P3 agreements that exist throughout the country. So how is it doing? Well, so far, since 2016, so 4-ish years ago now, it's funded only 9 projects, and the total amount of money invested is just $3.6 billion out of the total $35 billion. So not a lot of money is actually getting put out. And people are wondering, what is really the purpose of the Canadian Infrastructure Bank? I should also note that it spends about $11 million per year, I believe, on paying for its director and personnel costs. So it's costing taxpayers $11 million a year just to staff this thing. And again, it kind of is capturing all those tropes of inefficient, public services. The Crown Corporation says that it's there to help with infrastructure projects that otherwise wouldn't be built. So it's a bit of it's giving that extra boost of funding for projects that have, private investors interested, and it has some public money, either at the municipal level or the provincial level. And the $35 billion is of budget allocation is just to give those projects the extra boost they need so that they can be successful. I should say that the budget allocation isn't in the form of grants, so money that's just given. It's in the form of loans. So it's called an investment because the province, the provincial, municipal authorities that are in place that are investing, as well as the private entities, have to pay this money back, usually at low interest rates. And what this does is it assures that the risk for doing these projects is on the shoulders of taxpayers. So instead of private companies taking on higher levels of risk, which 2 slides ago was one of sort of the big selling features of P3s, this idea that the public wasn't taking on the risk, the private companies, which are able to have a lot more leverage and expertise with taking on risk, and are more interested in taking on risk because we know that more risk equals more reward when it comes to finance. The Canadian government was finding that private companies were no longer willing to take on the types of risk that they had in the past because a lot of these public infrastructure projects didn't end up actually being profitable in the long run for them. So how does the Canadian government fix this? It steps in and provides low interest loans to back a lot of these partnerships. So the Canadian taxpayer ends up taking on the risks that used to be shouldered by the private companies. Some other alarming things that I think warrant your attention are that the CIB announced in January 2020 that it saw a lot of potential in privatizing water supply in cities and towns. Again, the Infrastructure Bank isn't just for public transportation, although that's a big part of its purview and vision. It's also in charge of making investments happen in other types of public infrastructure, including water. Hopefully you know of the high levels of risk that come with privatizing public water, as what we saw in Flint, Michigan, and also Pittsburgh through private water management companies such as Leanne. The CIB is using their low interest loans, much like the Federal Reserve does or the Bank of Canada, in order to attract more private money. And they effectively underwrite some of the cost for these big projects. So in late August of last year, so in sort of like the pre-election run-up, Canada had an election last fall, you might remember. The TransLink's Mayor's Council, and you met Jonathan Cote, who's the chair of that council, raised a rallying cry for a traffic congestion relief fund. And this is essentially the Mayor's Council was pointing the finger at the Canadian government, saying that we can't have this type of ad hoc or leaving it up to the political winds type of funding infrastructure. The Canadian Infrastructure Bank was also not allocating funds quickly or efficiently. They were usually tied up in a lot of deals, trying to appease different private companies. Also, transit authorities were, spending a lot of time and energy trying to pitch different ideas, and it became essentially a bidding war to get some of this money. So the TransLink Mayor's Council took up this idea of a traffic congestion relief fund. So this originally this idea came about through the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, asked the federal government to stop this project-by-project transit investment structure and instead contribute $3.4 billion annually to a fund that's divvied up among Canadian cities based on ridership. So the more ridership there is in a city, the more of that $3.4 billion annual pot of money you have access to. For TransLink alone, this would amount to a contribution of $375 million a year. And you can see how this approach would be a viable way to bridge the gaps and bridge the problems present in the current way that public transportation is funded and the blended finance models that we've been working with here. So I've given you a moment to read through this quote, and it really has everything to do with the last point on the previous slide. What happens when private companies get involved in these sort of blended types of financial schemes that are backed by Canadian taxpayers is that they have an equity stake or ownership in these quote unquote public transit infrastructures. And what happens is that once the capital investments have been made and these public transportation infrastructures are built, the ownership now lies with private companies, or at least a portion of it lies with private companies. And it's not in their purview, it's not in their vision to provide a public service because they're a private corporation and a private company. Their sole motivation is profit. So a lot of the costs of operating and hiring personnel are downloaded to the user. And we see new types of barriers raised up in order for these private companies to try and make these so-called public transportation infrastructures viable and profitable. So whereas once fares collected or tolls collected, depending on the type of infrastructure, would go towards the maintenance and ensuring that the public had guaranteed access to these types of public goods. Now, those fares and tolls and other types of costs go straight to corporate coffers, as they're called by the Canadian Union of Public Employees. So this is one additional way that private stake in public transportation can be problematic. So this graphic is a little bit dated. It's from 2011, but I really like how it laid out how public transit is funded across the different provinces and territories. So you can take a minute here to see the amount of federal contribution, provincial, municipal fares, and other forms of revenue go into, is distributed differently across the different provinces and regions. So another way that private companies and corporations and entities are becoming interested in public transportation is through mobility as a service. And you often see this acronym as capital M, two lowercase a's, and an uppercase S. So MAS or MOS, I'm not really sure how it's pronounced. Mobility as a service is a Finnish concept, and it describes a shift away from personally owned modes of transportation towards different types of mobility solutions that are used as a service. So mobility as a service includes Uber and Lyft. It includes car shares, ride sharing, all those different types of newer things out in the transportation market. It also includes the development of apps on your phone that travelers can use to compare and purchase different trips across multiple modes. So Uber has publicly stated several times its interest in partnering with TransLink, and it's particularly interested in getting a hold of TransLink's Compass data. It wants to mine the bus and SkyTrain data in order to find ways to integrate public transportation into its Uber Transit app. So through the Uber Transit app, which is available in cities like Denver, you put in your trip and up pops all the different modes that you have your choice between. So it might involve, grabbing a scooter to get to the SkyTrain station, and then once you end up at, the final SkyTrain station, that's where you're going to get in your ride share. So TransLink has already partnered in the past with Evo and Moto and Mobi to make multimodal transit easier. And this is a different way that private money can come to play in transportation funding models, especially in areas that aren't related to capital investment. So when we talk about making systems more efficient or increasing ridership or investments in personnel, this is an avenue that TransLink and other transportation authorities are increasingly interested in pursuing, is bringing in these types of private mobility as a service companies. Of course, the critique here is that this is some form of industry capture, that Uber and Lyft are coming in and purporting to be better managers and overseers of public transportation, and then this is some form of a private takeover of this essentially public service. So those are the critiques that are floating around out there about mobility as a service and its connections to public transportation. So far, under the topic of urban transportation finance, we looked at funding from the top down, so how funding gets from the top through federal, provincial, municipal, down to public transportation authorities. We've looked briefly at partnerships, particularly mobility as a service partnerships that can help at least partially fund public transportation. And now it's time to shift to taking a bottom-up approach. So what are the different ways that users finance public transportation? And it can be done directly through taxation. So if you're a property holder, then maybe a portion of your property tax will be put towards public transportation. In Vancouver, we know that there is an additional public transportation gas tax and parking fees. So these are different ways that funding can come from the bottom up. But the people don't necessarily, the people that are paying these taxes might not be frequent users of public transportation. So how is it that users pay or finance public transportation? Well, the obvious answer is through ticketing, through fare revenue. And we're going to be talking about whether the different types of models for fare revenue are quote-unquote fair. So we're going to compare Vancouver and Toronto here. In Vancouver, roughly a third of total revenue, so that's all the money taken in by TransLink in a year. Roughly a third of that comes from fares. And in Toronto, it's twice as much, so roughly 2/3 of their total operating revenue every year come from fares. The signs here you'll see are from the TTC, so the Toronto Transit Authority, and these signs are plastered all over the trains and the bus stops, billboards even. So a lot of investment has been made in marketing material to ensure that people pay their fares. And a lot of investment is also made. They've roughly, I think it's, I'm going to find this and cite it here for you, tripled the amount of TTC sort of transit officers who go through the trains and double check that everybody has their ticket. And the salary for the people doing that work can be upwards of $70,000 a year. So Toronto is investing a lot in ensuring that that fare revenue remains a reliable stream.
I also just noticed the typo. It's definitely 1.2 million, not billion. So excuse the mistake there.
So what does this funding model mean for the users of public transportation? Well, unfortunately, in Toronto, we've seen a huge uptick in the number of people receiving fines. It can be a maximum fine of $400. The average fine is around $200 for not paying your fare. The photo on the right was posted to social media on March 19th, whereas most major cities have suspended the collection of fares during the COVID-19 pandemic, including TransLink. All public transportation has been made free. The TTC continues to operate as normal, and these are fare evasion officers stopping and checking to see if, and obviously they're also not practicing proper social distancing measures here. So sort of a stop and check policy continues to happen despite the pandemic. Videos have circulated online and in newspapers of TTC Transit Police pepper spraying suspects, wrestling them to the ground. And the campaign really targets people who can't afford their fares. And this is the sad thing about it. It's not like everybody is willingly trying to skirt paying their fare. The reality is that a lot of people maybe can't afford the $3 or $4 it takes to get to make the trips that they need to make, whether it be for work, to school, etc. And you can see here the graffiti that's been written on some of the signs in the TTC. It's asking for free transportation and to stop punishing poor people. There was a really excellent piece of research published in a transportation journal, but also in the New York Times, that makes a really compelling case for making all public transportation free. Seeing public transportation as more of a human right than sort of a privilege of citizenship. In cities where free transportation has been tested, ridership has increased anywhere from 20 to 60% almost immediately. And it has a tremendous impact on some urban areas' poorest urban dwellers. It has a huge impact on people's ability to move freely, to move through a city without fear, to move through cities without penalty. And it's also viewed as a key factor in bringing about social and racial equity in transportation. So taking these ideas, I'd love it if in your tutorial discussions you could discuss how the policing of fare evasion is connected with urban transportation finance, and try and use an intersectional lens. So how do funding models that rely mostly on the collection of fares, how does that impact different people depending on their social categorizations? So while this lecture has brought to you a lot of information about, multi-billion-dollar investments being done, sort of the gains that can be made to private companies that partner with public companies in transportation, $35 billion of investment over the next 11 years. These are big numbers. And it's important to balance these with how these investments are being experienced by the end users. And in order to do that, I want to bring this concept to you of transport poverty. So transport poverty is limited transit options compounded with socioeconomic disadvantage, and it prevents travel to important destinations such as employment opportunities. So while the Canadian government is currently investing billions of dollars in public transportation capital projects, so building shiny new railways and investing in more buses, there's very little guidance on whether and how this infrastructure can be used to achieve a higher degree of transport justice in our cities in Canada. So to be transport poor means that individuals are faced with a mix of disadvantages. So it might be socioeconomic status, and this can include low income, being in poor health, being a recent immigrant, being elderly. And it's compounded by a lack of access to transportation. So maybe you can't afford a car. Maybe it's difficult for you to reach your destinations easily. Transportation poverty occurs when this transport disadvantage compounds with other forms of potential social disadvantage. So this can result in an increased generalized cost of reaching destinations. So, for example, a lot of the funding models for fares should be based on distance, not necessarily zones. Because depending on where you live, you might not need to travel that far, but it can cost you, 2-3 times as much because of the zones you have to travel through. This is one example of what can happen in Vancouver. A study done by a former student of mine at another university found that, elderly people in Vancouver that had to get to appointments, different types of necessary things, were often paying, 2 or 3 times more than had they lived closer to where that is. So this is just one example of how the fare-based policy and fare-based pricing has differential impacts depending on your socioeconomic status, but also where you live in a city. And we know that these two things are connected. So it can create a vicious cycle. It can have long-run implications on quality of life and well-being, access to goods and services, ability to access political process, ability to find work and keep a job. All these things are connected with transportation. And the study that I'm bringing this information to you from, the Allen and Farber, found that up to 1 million Canadians qualify as sort of being transportation poor or experiencing transportation poverty. And there are other ways that this is experienced as well. For example, depending on your socioeconomic status, transportation can become more expensive. We've heard this adage a lot, that it's very expensive to be poor. So even though it's cheaper per trip to buy, a monthly Compass card up front, that works out to sort of a lower cost per trip, many people can't afford that big upfront cost and therefore end up paying more for trips that are more mandatory for them. So in tutorial, I hope you find some time as well to discuss the ways that socioeconomic or other disadvantages compound with transportation finance schemes and how these different combinations can lead to the experience of transportation poverty. So this is totally non-mandatory homework, but it might be a nice way to bridge connecting with friends and family members who you might not be able to physically be with right now, and also bring some interesting material into your tutorial discussions on Thursday. So yeah, do a bit of your own research. Try and connect with 3 friends or family members that you can't be with and ask them, who do they think pays for public transportation? How do they think that money is spent? And who should pay for public transportation? So it'd be neat to sort of get a general idea of what ideas are floating around out there about public transportation finance. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope you took some breaks. I hope you have some things to think over and discuss in tutorials. And while I miss seeing all of you in person, I hope that you're all doing as well as can be expected, and you're feeling okay about the final weeks of our course. Take care.